How are we starting this week?
We're starting great is what we're starting.
Yeah.
This is Michael.
Hey, it's Matt.
Yeah. Thanks, guys, for listening to us today.
Seriously.
We're pretty excited about our topic today.
I feel like it's a big one.
Yeah. A little intimidating, honestly.
Yeah.
Because I think Brett and Sam are both very, I guess their thoughts and their intellectual abilities are very, we both really respect both of them.
Definitely.
And we don't want to do them injustice. I think there's that part too. So
today we're taking an episode from Brett Weinstein's podcast where he talks to Sam Harris about free will. Mm-hmm. And we're going to talk about their podcast.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And hopefully we'll really kind of pull things apart a little bit and talk about the things that we thought were interesting. But then also I'm kind of hoping we'll, as the podcast gets further on, is talk about maybe some of our views and our thoughts on free will. I'm probably pulling like Paul Vanderklay has a couple episodes on this topic. Yeah,
I'm interested to hear what you have to say about that. You sent me those episodes, but I, in all honesty, have not watched them.
Yeah, it was pretty. It was just a good secondary, having somebody else like look at it and talk about it. So that was really fun to get to. So as far as kind of where we want to go from here is just to kind of, as we've kind of collected all of our thoughts on this topic, but then we want to try to, as much as possible, really capture their thoughts and ideas on this before we dive into it, into the shores of ignorance. And so we thank you guys and come along for the journey. We're heading out to
the shores of ignorance.
That was cheese.
That felt real weird. Let's go with it.
Yeah.
It's like a fleeting memory. Whatever you grab just turns to dust. Like eye contact with a stranger in a crowded room. Is a dream begging to reveal. The passing note of a song. The glimmer of the shifting sea. You think you saw it, you think you see it.
I like how I looked at you. I think we both were like, "Oh shit!"
There was some powerful eye contact there.
Yeah, the shores of ignorance.
Okay, let's get into it. This is a big episode that we're talking about. It's about 3.5 hours long. So much content in there. I wrote down a bunch of thoughts. How should we jump in?
Well, maybe we could do it this way, because I don't, as far as I want to really do Sam's position and kind of the idea of steel man, Sam's position, like really give it a real, as much as possible, an accurate view of how he sees things. Because it's really hard for me, because there's a few things that I really have problems with specifically. But I really want to, because I feel like that's what that podcast did so well was, I think Brett did a great job of pulling that more of Sam's ideas out in a reasonable way.
Let's start there, because I think that you felt that way pretty strongly, which I think is the impetus for us having this conversation on our podcast. Yeah. That's really what I heard you taking away from that, was that you appreciated Brett's sort of deft ability to pull something out of the conversation. And I agree, but I'd like to hear you articulate what you think about that.
Okay. Let me try to do this. So basically, Sam has a very deterministic outview or look on life, which is there is no free will. So there's a lot of complications. I want to get into that later on in how he describes that. But I think as you watch that podcast or listen to that podcast, that's the main thing you have to kind of run with, is that everything is determined. So if you knew all the different mathematics and physics and biology, that you would be able to predict all the way into the future.
See, I listened to the podcast twice, and I never could come to a place where I thought Sam actually believes in this position.
I know. That's the problem. And I think that's where, so Brett and Sam both agree that a deterministic view on the world is very hard to disagree with. And I think that's where Brett started kind of pushing in, kind of going a little bit. He basically was saying that we're not as free as we think we are. And the main point that Brett kept bringing up to Sam was that if everything is determined, then like our conversation doesn't really matter because we're just acting out what we're already predetermined to do. So there's sort of the intellectual honesty.
Not even acting out.
No, yeah.
We are being driven to do and say the things that we do and say via the effect of some previous cause that we had no control over. Which is a mind-numbing thing to think about. Also a very dismal thing to think about.
Yeah.
And I kind of appreciated Brett's point of view on that, where he just sort of said, if the universe is determined, if everything that we are saying now to each other is predetermined, then there's no point to talking about this at all, because it's just sort of a movie reel spinning off into eternity.
Yeah. And that was, in fact, that's where like the problem kept coming back is then Sam wanted to talk about it in this sort of like, he uses words like, if you pay close enough attention to what it's like, what I pay attention to. So he's using all the language of free will, which is really difficult to put your head around his position because he keeps talking about feel like, watching, all these sort of like agencies, like a separate agency from the deterministic viewpoint. And I've listened to a few other of his, he just kind of keeps kind of popping out of the deterministic viewpoint, and I could never really. I was trying to really understand, like, okay, what is he seeing here? And the only thing I could really get is he sees a psychological component, and somehow the psychological component is not tied to the determinism. So it's sort of like you can observe yourself and the thoughts that come into your brain and out your mouth, and you're observing them, but you have no control of what's actually coming out of your mouth.
But you can bear witness to it.
You can bear witness to it.
So what does that mean?
Well, I think before we get to that, because I think there's some things, I think to kind of suss out that observation mode is really fascinating, because we'll put this in the show notes, but there's a guy named Benjamin Libet, which did this experiment with EEGs on your brain, and like you do an action, but before you would make the decision to do the action, it would activate in the brain, and then there was a pause between the thought, the decision, and then the action. And so a lot of his argument flows from sort of this Benjamin Libet example, and again, not being. I was trying to understand exactly what that actually means, and I think it's funny because like then the narrative and the story of what that means is what he's kind of going off of, as far as like we don't even know what we're going to think before we think it.
Well, that was something. That's an interesting place to maybe dive in, because that was something that is interesting that Sam continued to say, is that thoughts sort of arrive in your brain from unknown places. He said they sort of arrive in your brain as a hummingbird through a window. Yeah. Which I think we all relate to. Things sort of light up somewhat unexpectedly. And he uses that as an argument for there's no free will. These things sort of happen. But there's a contradiction in the argument as well, because he also says that everything can be described by some previous cause that you had no control over. And maybe those two things are congruent, but I see sort of two sides to that, because I see the thought that arrives in your brain as a hummingbird through a window. If I sit and think long enough, I can find an origin for it. I can at least find the context from which it came. Yeah. It's not an easy thing to do, though. And I think probably most of us in our default state, don't put a lot of thought to that. So it's like we all know the effect of sitting with somebody and arriving at some strange point of silence, and you might say to the other person, what are you thinking about? What's on your mind? And that person will probably sort of awaken, like as if waking from a dream, and be like, well, what was I thinking about? And if they are self-aware enough, can probably internally think of 100 things they were just thinking about. And with enough effort can probably tie them all together and tell you some wacky, strange story about how they got to the thought that they were on, based upon some obscure reference that happened 3 seconds earlier.
Yeah.
And Sam seems to describe that from two separate sides, and I can't tell if he brings them together or not. But he says he seems to think that is an argument against the existence of free will, which I can't follow.
Well, it's hard too because I'll, just as a thought experiment, I was going through this, trying to encapsulate his view of free will and determinism, and so I would kind of just observe the thoughts that were coming. And this is also a meditation practice too. It's like you observe the thoughts that are coming out of your brain, and you don't make a judgment on them. It's more of like, you're just like, oh, look at that. I'm thinking about this. Well, what is that? Or how is that? But then all of a sudden you're like the observers, the observing,
Yeah.
You kind of have this like, but then my question is just by observing what you're thinking about, does that change into the future by just the mere observation of what you were pondering or whatever?
Well, I think quantum physics would say yes. In my own experiences, yes.
Yeah.
I'm not sure to which direction to take this, because I have some thoughts on. I'd love to talk about consciousness versus unconsciousness, the conscious versus unconscious, because Sam seems to put a lot of weight into that. But I feel like we might be attacking this conversation on too many fronts at the same time.
Totally.
What if we start from trying to define what it is that we think free will might be if it exists?
Okay. I think it's really difficult. I kind of like where Brett was going, or how he stated it, is we might not be as free as we think we are.
Yeah.
And that there probably is degrees of freedom. So some people may be more free than other people. And we're talking not just like physically free, where you have like, in a slave situation, or more in a physical sense, but more in your own thoughts and actions. And part of me wonders if there's that part that's the more of the animal part of who we are, our instinctual aspects, versus our reasoning capabilities, and what sets us apart from animals, and being able to be somewhat self-determined in some form or fashion. What does that mean? That's really.
So I think I agree that we're probably not as free as we imagine that we are. But I get a little bit hung up on the definitions, because I think that Sam would say, if I can explain where a thought came from, then you were not free to think it. And so there's a time component where one mode of viewing says, if I can look back and explain the origin, then the outcomes were not of any free will. So free will, as defined that way, has to exist in some sort of vacuum with no influence. And I would say, I think free will is exactly, and maybe only, influence. That's what free will is. All this talk about that, well, so I'm getting some things mixed up, because I I think you and I both read Sam's book, Freewill, after listening to the Brett and Sam podcast. But in that book, he talks a lot about consciousness. And so I was pondering what it is that is consciousness. And I think one of the best definitions that I've heard recently is that consciousness arose out of an awareness of vulnerability. And that awareness of vulnerability sort of taught us two things. One, it taught us that we were vulnerable and that we needed to protect ourselves. It also taught us that other people are vulnerable and we can take advantage of that. And those two things combined allowed us or forced us to start thinking about the future and planning for the future. And the future is an infinite set of possibilities. And what we do is plan for our own longevity, plan for our own protection. And part of that is the manipulation of the world in order to match the chaos that we see of the possible futures and choose one and attempt to mold the future or bend the future as closely to that as possible. And that is, as I see it, influence. And that is the free will that I exercise. I can make a choice to do one of a many number of things. And I don't make that choice in a vacuum. I don't make it without previous influence. And so I think Sam would say, well, you're making the choices that you make because of some, as he says, push from behind. So because of my DNA and my genetics, because of the way that I was brought up, I think about things in a very certain way. And so I make the choices that I make because of all of that. I think that all of that informs the choices that I make, but I still get to decide whether I execute on those or not. In that manner, I I reduce an infinite number of futures or I participate in reducing an infinite number of futures into one which comes to bear as I live second by second.
I think that's why it's so tricky in describing free will is you have this dichotomy of freedom and determinism that we see there's all these effects that affect our decision making, but we also have this component where we see the influence aspect that narrows those possibilities into the future.
It places a value judgment on the different possibilities as I sort of manifest the possibility of them into my planning of the future.
And I think that's where I think I love that this podcast so much, in that it shows that you can't go to one extreme or the other. And so I think I love it because Sam is so hard pressed on this deterministic aspect, but you just keep feeling that pull of choice and free will in how he was talking and describing things. And so I feel like, because I think I've heard more of the free aspect a lot more as far as or maybe I'm more drawn to that part of having how free are you, and I think it's kind of nice to hear the other side of there's all these other forces and things that are having an impact on your future that you have no control over. And that is true.
Well, that's one thing that I find difficult about the way Sam argues in general, is he tends to push the positions to their extremes and then simplify and reduce such that they almost are left with no power. So there's a lack of nuance and there's a lack of resolution. So for instance, he'll use an example like in his book, he references a number of instances of people killing other people. And so in one case he says, well, this guy killed this woman, and it turned out that he had a large tumor in his prefrontal cortex. And that sort of explains his behavior, which makes sense. But I don't really find that compelling in an argument about free will.
Yeah.
Because I think that is an extreme which does nothing to add to the topic at hand.
Well, I think it's...
Am I being simplistic about that?
No, but he kind of does this, and I find he's doing this less and less, which is after Peterson and Brett. I think there's just a lot more public intellectuals aren't allowing him to use because I mean, in the Peterson debate or conversation
with Sam,
it was
so yeah.
No.
I just want to explain that. So Sam Harris and Jordan Peterson began a debate talking about, I don't remember what they were trying to start talking about, but they ended up hung up on this idea of essentially whether or not truth existed. And it's a really fascinating conversation, that episode. And then they went and debated each other on that in public, in person, like a 4-series.
4 series. First 2 were Brett Weinstein did it with
moderating
in Vancouver, and then the second was Douglas Murray, moderated in the UK. Oh shoot, I forgot what I was gonna say. Oh yeah, he kind of brings up these shocker examples,
right?
In that one it was masturbation, and then the audience laughs, and you just lost the thread, you know?
Yeah, Brett tried to bring that thread back.
Yeah, he did.
But I find that the conversation between Brett and Sam even got a little slippery when he brought that back. It's like he didn't really want to be held down to something. And that's kind of what I found. The general feeling I had from that podcast, from the episode between Brett and Sam, was that Sam doesn't want to be held down by anything.
Well, and that it also feels that he has such a adverse reaction to religion in general, and again, also in that Peterson, Sam, Douglas Murray brought this up to Sam, was like, you're afraid that someone's going to smuggle Jesus in on you.
Yeah.
I just love that, which is so true. Like, when he said that, I was like, oh, that makes so much sense. Like, anything that has a religious aspect to it or a spiritual aspect to it, Sam just like, he just sticks his feet down and won't continue the conversation at all.
Yeah. I felt him do that whenever Brett used language like purpose or meaning.
Yeah.
There was a very adverse, almost allergic reaction to those terms, which I felt I found that really interesting. And I think I found it interesting because there's sort of a culmination of thoughts that I think you and I've talked somewhat about. I think some of it comes from the Ian McGilchrist stuff that we've been reading. But also this, I think I sort of arrived at this somewhat independently, but the idea that we almost don't see anything for what it is. We see things for what they mean, to the extent that if something doesn't mean something to us, we almost don't see it at all.
Yeah.
And I'd like to try to approach that idea here because I find it so fundamental to the way that we interact with the world that I'm surprised that Sam pushes against it so hard, against the idea that meaning has any value.
Yeah.
And I think it must be a defense of his position of atheism, because meaning is a quick, slippery slope into the ultimate other, which is commonly described through religion, which he has an adverse reaction to.
Yeah, I mean, he has a reaction. I mean, even because he does tend towards like a lot of Buddhist type stuff, but he'll even say it's more of the practical aspects of Buddhism, not Buddhism itself. So he always makes a distinction, but it's interesting that he does. Yeah, the meaning part that he really did have an adverse reaction to, mm-hmm. but it comes back to Brett's point was that this doesn't mean anything. Our interaction has no point if it has this deterministic aspect to it.
Yeah, to which Sam said, well, there need not be any concept of meaning.
Mm-hmm.
Which I thought, but there is.
Yeah.
And I guess it's easy enough to say, well, that's just an illusion. It doesn't exist.
Mm-hmm.
But it does exist.
Yeah.
Because I have felt it and described it, mustn't it exist?
Mm-hmm. There's also this thing, the Paul Vanderklay one that just came out tonight. I watched it right before we came over here.
Yeah, tell me about it.
Oh, shoot. Now I forgot what I was going to say. So this guy, Carl, who was on, he made this point that pretty much I was just like, oh, wow, I'd love to hear the response to this. I can almost, I'll put out what I think Sam's response to this will be after I say it. But so Sam believes that if you had all the right machines and all the right stuff, you could predict the future because everything is determined and it would flow as it would. And so the guy was like, well, this is really easy to defeat. His name's Carl. I don't know his last name. He said, well, I would just say, what did the machine say I was going to do next?
Mm-hmm.
And do the exact opposite.
Right. Well, but this is that presupposes that the machine is not all inclusive of reality because mm-hmm. you have to be outside of it to say, what does it say?
Mm-hmm.
Which is a claim that doesn't seem to be disputed in the free will conversation,
mm-hmm.
which I think is maybe one of the most interesting ones.
We'll say that again. I don't think I followed them.
Well, essentially the idea that you can be an observer,
mm-hmm.
that I can say, what does the machine say that I'm going to do next? Which
mm-hmm.
means I have to be outside the machine. But in the idea, within the concept of determinism, there is no outside.
Yeah.
Everything is inside.
Mm-hmm.
So you couldn't say that.
Mm-hmm.
You couldn't make that claim.
Well, that's how I would think Sam would approach that.
But he doesn't.
Yeah.
He constantly talks about being outside.
Mm-hmm.
He constantly talks about
the psychological component.
Yeah.
Which is
I think is the consciousness component.
Mm-hmm.
The ability to have an abstract understanding of time
mm-hmm.
and say that there is a past and there's a future, and I can hold both of those things present in my mind as I evaluate something.
Mm-hmm.
And I can evaluate something, including myself.
Mm-hmm.
I can look at my own desires. I can look at my own fears. I can look at my own shortcomings and weaknesses.
Yeah.
And I can put all those together and make a value judgment on all of those things and say, this is the way I'd like to be in the future. And based upon at least it's helpful in this context to describe the past as deterministic.
Mm-hmm.
What has been determined through my past actions has dictated the way that I am now, and I either like or don't like that, and so I'm either going to continue or change and adjust.
Mm-hmm.
The fact that whether I do or don't, the fact that I can sit here at any one moment and make and have those thought processes, to me, well, I don't know how you argue exactly that I have no free will when I'm able to do that.
Well, I think that's the problem with this. Oh, so okay, Sam just said everything is determined. It is that it is. There is no meaning. End of story.
Okay,
I think it would be so easy.
Can we talk about that for a second and just how depressing that is?
Well, it doesn't matter. You wouldn't know or be depressed by it.
Exactly.
If you were depressed by it, it doesn't matter. You were going to be depressed by it anyways, so deal with it.
But the fact that, but this is my whole point about meaning, the fact that the majority of the way that we make decisions is based upon the way that we feel, and the way that we feel is made up of all of these things which in a deterministic universe have no place. All of these things which exist within this self-awareness perch that allow me to be depressed.
See, that's the thing, is that it makes so much sense if Sam were to have said full-on deterministic. But
I don't think he never did.
But he never does. But that's the thing, is like, that's the argument is, and when Brett challenges him on that.
Well, he seems to go along with Brett when he challenges him on it until Brett uses words like purpose.
Purpose and meaning, yeah. Mm-hmm.
So how would you define, let's reduce to meaning for now. How would you define meaning? What is meaning?
What is the meaning of life?
No, not even the meaning of anything yet. Just like, what do we mean when we say this means something?
Golly, that's a really... Wow, I don't know if I can really... Well, so I can think of, my relationship with Allison. That's a very meaningful relationship. Like, we share experiences together, that there's an interaction that, and a connection with something other that is real, that provides meaning. So it may be hard. It may be easier for me to even think about the things that I thought did have meaning but don't have a meaning, or even degrees of meaning. My business means a lot to me, but it's not the same meaning as our purpose that my wife and my kids have for me. There's something about the people that work for me have more meaning than the business itself. There's all these different degrees of...
But is there any business without the people? No.
Well, I mean, I'm just trying to think of, like, because, some people are really like, I guess when I first started, a guy, his name's Jim, told me, is like, the biggest investments you'll make in your life are in your wife, your kids, and yourself. And, it's like your business, it may come and go. You might do well, you might not do well. Mm-hmm. But I think there's even a biological and maybe evolutionary aspect that is also an explanation in that area.
Yeah.
But I don't know. How would you how would you go about that?
Yeah, I'm trying to pull some thoughts together here. So Sam says in the conclusion of his book Freewill, at the end of this, I'm hungry. I think I might go get something to eat. But whether or not I do, and sort of like runs this thought experiment about how he has no free will. And he says, you can tell yourself a story about the past that may seem to mean something to you, but ultimately you were going to do what you were going to do.
Yeah.
And with that one sort of stroke, dismisses the idea that stories have creative power and belittles a story to a simple description of the past.
Yeah.
And intuitively, I think we know that's not true.
Yeah.
Or most people would say there's a difference between a description and a story.
Yeah.
The difference is that a story holds meaning, which is a difficult idea to articulate exactly, but I think we tried to talk about it on the last episode. The idea that language, and I'll swap story for language, that stories encode things. Mm-hmm. They contain more than the words that they consist of.
Yeah.
They contain morals, they contain lessons, they contain weight, they contain light, darkness, all of these ineffable sort of things. Stories have creative power.
Okay,
And
yeah, I got you.
so I would say, so earlier I said that we see things based upon what they mean and not what they are. So I think I had this thought experiment a while back, and I think you and I talked about it, but so I'll take something as potentially insignificant or mundane as this table that we're sitting around.
Mm-hmm.
Well, how do I describe this object as it is? It's arbitrary. It has no context.
Mm-hmm.
It is shapes and dimensions. But in my life and in your life, it is a place for us to sit, to do something.
Yeah.
And that could be to eat a meal. That could be to sit here and have this conversation. That could be to hold the things that are necessary or helpful or beneficial for those activities. But there is implicit in the word table a whole set of possibilities, a whole set of past experiences embedded and encoded in a glance at this object. So I glance at this object and my brain shorthand goes, that's a table. What's it for? I know what it's for, or at least I know what it's possibly for. And so that's why, so I say, I think we see everything that way.
Yeah.
We see everything based upon what it means to us or what it means for us rather than what it is. To the extent that things that don't have that embedded in them for us don't arise into our consciousness at all.
Yeah.
So I'm tempted to say, and I haven't thought this completely through, but I think that I would say that meaning is the sense or intuition or understanding that there is a story going on. That it has a past and it has a future, and that it is being told currently, and that I am participating in it. And that means something.
Yeah.
Like, there is a fortifying effect of that experience when you experience it. When you feel fortified, you feel engaged, you feel a narrowing of your energy and your perspective, or your sort of attentional gaze, as it may be.
Yeah.
That seems to be what we say, well, that had meaning. And I think that that's about the story that we see playing out as it happens.
Yeah. Well, that makes sense. Because even like if you think about the story that Sam is presenting to Brett, it doesn't make sense. It's sort of like if you have a character in a story that's acting in a way that is contrary to how someone should act. You're like, well, what's wrong with that character? Like, it's not, there's something off.
Yeah.
And that's kind of like, so Sam's trying to tell this story, how it's determined, all these things are determined, but the story's not convincing. Everyone, at least it's to some degree, I would think, and even Sam himself is going, but psychology, observation, if you pay close enough attention.
Well, maybe that's, yeah.
So the story
right,
starts to
exactly.
break down. You're like, whoa. And all of a sudden the twist comes. It's like, wait a minute. Are we in a deterministic world, or what is this? Pay attention. What is this? I feel. What is this? We're watching this movie unfold or play out, or it's already. So it starts having these little jolts that something's wrong with the story. And I think that's also Brett makes that same point. Is like, okay, I can't argue against a deterministic world but you can't have meaning. This means nothing.
And I think is a good reason to argue against a deterministic world.
Yeah.
Because we do have meaning. And I'm not sure that, I think Sam wants to argue against that, but I don't think that he could honestly do it.
Well, he just wrote a book about lying.
Right.
Yeah, which is hilarious. I mean, I don't think he is lying. I think he really does believe. That's the thing. I was trying to wrap my mind around how he was like really, because I think he's very honest. He might get stuck in the mud in some areas, but I do believe like if he saw something different, then he would change his mind on something. Because I've almost seen him kind of move in some areas that I thought he was a little bit too strict on. Like even when they were talking about religion later on, I've never heard him say like, oh, there are good things about religion, but then he quickly brought up witchcraft and like sidelined the whole thing. It's
another parlor trick.
Yeah, it really is. It's like, let's take like something that, very few people like, it's easier to bring in like, Christianity or Judaism or Islam, which represents a larger proportion of people to argue a point like that,
Yeah.
But, he tries to find the most obscure points but going back to the story, I think there's that part I think this part that you brought up is really valuable because we have these facts, but facts don't do us any good if we don't provide a narrative for those facts. So the facts have to fit into some sort of narrative. So we try to develop these narratives based on these facts, like, you said, hey, come over tonight. We're going to film the podcast. So there's a fact, that fits into this story that we do this podcast, so, and I come over and it's like, oh, we're doing this very thing. And it matches up with that fact that you said, come over and this is happening right now. But I think that might have been a little bit of a stretch on my storytelling, but I think that definitely has, you have to be able to, the facts have to fit into some sort of narrative, whether it be like an evolutionary narrative. We're trying to tell some story or something like that.
I don't know that the facts have to fit into a narrative.
Yeah.
I don't know that that's the way to phrase it. I don't think it's that they have to. I think it's that they do. And there's no way to, I don't think, frame any fact outside of a narrative, because even the idea of our concept of fact is embedded inside of a narrative.
Yes.
Like there is no way for us to say this fact exists alone outside of everything else.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that's the part I think that's the part I'm arguing against is sort of like there's this idea that there's all these facts out there and they stand outside the narrative. And then if we just believe these facts,
right,
then we'll be...
Well, but you use the word believe.
I know, but again, it's like it has to fit into the narrative or a narrative of some sort. So that's.
Well, I would say it doesn't have to fit into the narrative. I would say that the things that you could potentially set up as fact arrive out of the narrative. That's the problem.
Is that the chicken or the egg type thing?
No, I don't think so. I mean, it's the way that we arrive at anything we call fact. So I think one point of view would say facts are arrived at via what? Scientific method. Mm-hmm. It's the best fact determining method that we have, right? Mm-hmm. What is the scientific method?
You have a certain amount of information. Yeah.
Create a hypothesis. Mm-hmm. Create a test, run it, confirm or deny that hypothesis to some degree of believability. Mm-hmm. If that degree of believability is high enough, publish, reproduce. Mm-hmm. If enough people reproduce it, then it's fact. Mm-hmm. None of that is airtight.
Yeah, but I think too is like, when you make your hypothesis, it's usually based on some sort of observation that has to do with maybe two facts coming together in a new way.
Okay.
And then you're making a hypothesis on what the result of those two facts are. Maybe it's even two narratives.
Yeah, I would say that your hypothesis is abstracted out of a narrative and then tested. But I think even the testing and confirming or denying is another narrative in and of itself, because it has to do with you. It has to do with your own fallibility. Because how did you run the test? Was it good enough? This is exactly why we have peer review is such an important part of science.
Yeah.
Because we can't trust you because you're fallible. You have your own malicious intentions that you're not even conscious of, your own biases that you're not even conscious of, right? But then so does everybody else who's running it. And so we all agree that something is a fact. That doesn't mean it's a fact. It just means that we agree. It doesn't mean it's a fact in that if we're trying to arrive at something as fact outside of the narrative, outside of whatever story you want to tell about it, it is what it is, no matter what you have to say about it. And I just don't think that I don't think that we can identify anything like that.
Yeah.
Because I think everything exists within our understood narrative.
Yeah.
And I think actually that was Jordan's point in his conversation with Sam, was that he was saying you're trying to nest ethics within science, and it is necessarily the other way around.
Oh,
science is always nested within ethics.
Yeah.
And I think that's the same as saying that facts arise out of narrative and not the other way around.
Well, it's a little bit difficult. So the fact of gravity, like you drop something and it falls to the ground, like that, there's not really a narrative associated with that.
Sure there is.
All right, give it to me. I want to hear it.
Well, this is the theory of relativity.
Okay.
That there is no difference between what I experience as gravity sitting here on the earth and what I would experience in a vacuum accelerating at, I don't know what the speed is, but the equivalent of, I'm going to accelerate such that I feel a certain amount of gravitational force. There's no difference. So gravity, as understood as what keeps me to the earth, is no different experientially than what I would experience accelerating a spacecraft in space. So what is gravity?
Oh God, yeah.
I don't experience gravity as a thing outside of context.
Yeah.
It is my own experience, which is embedded. It's nested in a observational viewpoint.
Damn, that's good, dude. But I would say, the fact of whether, depending on your, could you go here like where that same gravity still has an effect, some sort of effect, depending on the. I'm thinking of nested story now. Relative to your position, whether you're on the Earth or in the spacecraft or on the moon, but there still is a thing called gravity. And so it's not, and how, I guess, more the effects of gravity is nested within whatever framework that you're in. So the effects are different, but gravity's still a fact, I guess. Would that be?
I think we experience it as something to be contended with. It is a concept which takes its shape and has its literal weight depending on the context that you're in. Yeah. So it is something to be contended with, is something to be felt and dealt with and understood. but I'm not sure that you can conceptualize it as, I guess, something that exists outside of space and time. Mm-hmm. Well, you literally can't, because gravity is dependent on time. Mm-hmm. It's all very strange.
Yeah.
And I'm not. This is something I'd love to learn more about, because I'm sure somebody listening is like, you're really getting this wrong. But
no, that's the truth. But the thing is like we've never claimed we're experts, so we're just two guys on the shores of ignorance.
Just two dudes.
Well, I think this narrative aspect is such a. Well, I don't know if we want to go here yet. As far as I know, one thing I do want to get into is how, like, both of you and I believe that we have some aspect of freedom, free will, and it's like what that means. And then we've kind of been talking about how that is. There's this part that's nested in meaning and how we create meaning. And not just, even that is interesting too, because it's not just us creating meaning, but also all the stories that have come before us that have produced this meaning web or network that we are now in. You know, it's like we have, as a nation, we have the Declaration of Independence, you know, the Bill of Rights, the Constitution, and so we're nested in this story of, you know, of a semi-capitalistic country, republic, you know, and so but within those stories, we're also creating new stories, like, you know, your music, you know, you're creating new stories that are also within a larger context, you know. I mean, and then you can take that, like, and just build all the way back to even, you know, Athens and Greece and Jerusalem and, Judeo-Christian, you know, a lot of the things that have come that have influenced where we are as a Western society in the United States. So it's like it's like stories nested within stories, nested within stories, you know. So there's a certain context there that we are. I mean, even all the different periods, like the Enlightenment that have kind of led to a lot of the scientific revolution that we have today. Where were we going with that? Oh yeah. So how much freedom, you know, do we have? I think that's something that I would really be interested in. And are some people more free than others? What determines that freedom too? Yeah,
I do think there is a concept put forward in the podcast and in Sam's book Free Will, that free will, at least as it's set up in order to tear down, is that a person has the ability to choose what they want and make that happen. And that's clearly not true. And I think that's why Brett says we are surely not as free as we believe that we are, or sort of experience that we are. I think I'm really consciously aware that the way that I think about things, the way that I think about things is the context in which I exercise my free will. And the way that I think about things, to a degree that I can't quantify, comes from my family history in very strange ways.
Yeah.
So, like, we talked, I think it was in the Accessing the Ancient episode with Allison. I was telling the story about how this photo was taken of my son and me and my dad sitting around a campfire, and we're all sitting exactly the same way, legs crossed the same way, hands folded the same way, head sort of cocked just so. It's like, that's DNA. Like, my son was, I think at the time, 7 or 8. He didn't, I don't think this is a learned behavior, but we all did it. I clearly exist within some fabric that was woven without my say-so. And that does determine the way that I see things.
Yeah.
Or at least sets the stage for the way that I see things. And thank God. Because if I had the ability to see anything that I wanted in any way that I possibly could, that would just be absolutely too much. I wouldn't be able to comprehend anything.
Yeah. There needs to be a little bit of restriction.
There needs to be restriction. And we talked about that last time. Like, it's like limiting, putting restrictions on things makes people more creative. And I think that it's the same concept, that your DNA somehow dictates that you have a certain disposition towards trouble. You have a certain disposition towards success, a certain even disposition towards freedom. And you enter the stage that way.
Yeah.
You don't get to choose otherwise. But you do get to choose what you do on that stage.
Yeah. Yeah. It's like, I will never be Michael Jordan. You know, it's like, I don't have the physical capabilities, even if I trained, you know, every day for the rest of my life. So there's that sort of like restriction to, that's not available to me. Like, I'm not free enough to be Michael Jordan or be the best basketball player. You know?
Well, that's an interesting way to frame it, though. To say I'm not free enough to be Michael Jordan.
Well, so you were making that case as sort of like you have these parts that are that you're somewhat determined in or restricted in, and so when you look at, like, if I was completely free, then, you know, if I worked hard enough, I could be the best basketball player on the planet.
Well, okay, so defined that way, free to enact any outcome I can imagine,
Yeah.
then no, I do not have free will.
Yeah. Yeah, we definitely. I think that's the things where right now we're kind of shaping is seeing that there are limits to. Well, there's a certain amount of restriction that we have for. Hey, cheers.
Thank you.
There's a certain amount of restriction that we do have. And then we have to be creative within what those restrictions are. And also...
Well, I would say we don't have to be creative. The restrictions enable us to be creative because they give us enough definition with which to be creative. I mean, without the restriction, there's no definition at all. There's no creation at all. And I think that really ties closely to the idea that everything is about narrative. Without some sort of narrative context... there's nothing to be done.
Yeah. What's going through my head right now is you know, when you hear stories that, you know, someone's come from a background that is just absolutely horrific.
Okay, let's use one of those examples because I think Sam's fond of those.
Yeah. Let's do it, Sam.
So somebody's background which is horrific.
Yeah, I mean, you know, molested as a child, beat, you know, it's like has had, you know, maybe parents die, you know, I don't know if I can't even go there really. You know, it's like that is a shitty place to be, and that's so many circumstances that are out of your control as an individual. You know, so what do you do with that?
Well, I would say you can either choose to tell the story about yourself that you are the result of everything that's out of your control, or you can, and so everything is bad. Everything is oppressive. Or you can tell the story to yourself, I came out of a past which was out of my control and really set me up badly, and I'm choosing to change that. I'm choosing to change my outcome. I'm going to use that for something which I value, I deem and judge as better. And I think there's really great examples of both of those things.
Yeah.
So we are not the determined sum or outcome of our past or the things that happened to us. Neither are we free from it. Like we are in some way, I was going to say enslaved by it, but I don't think it's that we're enslaved by it. We are defined by it in a way that sets the stage.
Yeah.
So there's like the 3-part story arc, which is in most stories that are 3 acts long. It's like introduction of characters, introduction of conflict, resolution of conflict. And I think that at any given point in your life, you can say, the characters have been introduced, the conflict has been introduced. So what happens next? There are some movies that we watch that they just end.
Yeah.
We get to know some people, some shit happens, and then the movie's over.
Yeah.
And we all want a refund. It's like, that's not a satisfying story.
Well, it's interesting though, because there's a time where I think there was so much resolution that the conflict in it not being resolved actually was something we wanted. You know?
Yeah, and I think there's something to be said about the evolution of storytelling in that.
But then it got old hat. It's like, oh, here's another one of those that doesn't resolve the,
Right.
If that makes sense.
Well, but my point is like, you can look at your past and say, there are characters, there's conflict, and I am here now, and I am either going to resolve that conflict or I'm going to perpetuate the conflict. And this is the story that you get to choose to tell.
Yeah.
And which is the one. And you can easily and rightfully choose either one.
Yeah.
And your disposition towards that choice is going to depend a lot on the people before you. I mean, I think this is the moral that's encoded in the sins of the father are passed down through the generations. That's that idea.
Well, you think about every time, I would almost say every time that you see somebody overcoming something, you always hear this in their story. This person gave me a new narrative. You know, it was a teacher, it was a professor, it was my uncle, my grandfather. It's like they gave me a different narrative. And I think that's as you were saying those things, I was like, well, where does that come from? And every single person, biography wise, that I've read, it's that as far as big changes, it's like somebody gave them a new narrative. And I think there's something that what you believe about the world has such a huge impact on how you interact with it. Your narrative is so important.
Yeah.
Like if your narrative is that, I mean, if you take Sam's, and I think he doesn't even go all the way there, that sort of deterministic, I have no choice. This is all played out. It's like, it's going to cause you to interact with that. He says no, but it's so frustrating because it's like he says no, but then he acts differently.
I know, that is frustrating. Well, what would it be like if we played out or tried to play out? What would it be like if we accepted a deterministic world?
Well, it would be really easy. I mean, because it's like we wouldn't have to really do anything.
Well, but you wouldn't have to. Actually, you would have to.
Yeah.
That is the thing, is you would have to. Everything that you do because you have to.
Yeah, but
there's no other option.
But I think the thing is you wouldn't know any better.
Saw